Today we're going to take a look at graphing rational equations. So the first thing I want to take you to do is take a look at these 6 rational equations. And then I want you to pause the video and spend a couple minutes. What do you notice about these? What's similar? What's different? Where are the asymptotes? All that kind of stuff, and see what you can find. So pause the video, and why don't you discuss this with the people around you? So, some things you may have discussed is these are all swoopies. We've got swoops going up, swoops going down. Some people might have even noticed there's this asymptote here. This is at 1, our asymptote's at 1. We got something at 3. There's one at 3, -1. Here's one at -3. Here's one at +3, and then all the rest are at 0. You may have noticed that when this number is greater than 1, it's a swoop going up. These fraction ones here, less than 1, I should say fractions between 0 and 1, and end up going down. So we're going to talk about how do we graph these exponential equations here without a calculator. Well, let's see. So this first one, we should look at it and say it's a swoop. And it's probably it's a swoop going up, and -3. So we know at -3, -3, there's an asymptote. So we could dash that in at -3. Okay, well, let's just make an XY table. So let's say we plug in 0. Let's find the y-intercept. So we have 2 to the 0 plus 1 minus 3. So that's 2 to the first minus 3. So 2 minus 3 is -1. What if we plug in 1? So 2 to the 1 plus 1 minus 3. So 2 squared minus 3. 4 minus 3 is 1. What if we plugged in -1? Let's see, 2 to the -1 plus 1 minus 3. 2 to the 0 minus 3. So that's 1 minus 3. So that's -2. So if we graph these, 0, -1, oops, I got to make that a little bit bigger. What else did we have? 1, 1. And then we had -1, -2. So that makes sense. We have our swoop. So if we were to look at domain and range on this, we could say that the domain is all reals, and our range, well, our y values are always greater than -3. So what about this next one? 3 times 1/4 x plus 2. Well, we don't have a big +1 or +3 anything, so that means our asymptote has to be at 0. Let's see, it's 1/4, so it's going to be a swoop that's going down. So let's make a table here. What do we get when we plug in 0? So 3 times 1/4, 0 plus 2. So 3 times 1/4 squared. We have to square the top and bottom, so 3 times 1/16. So that's 3/16. Let's see, well, when I look at this exponent, I like to make that 0 at one point. So let's put in -2. So 3 times 1/4, -2 plus 2. So 3 times 1/4 to the 0 power. So that's just 3 times 1. So that's 3. I don't know, maybe I'll put in a 1. So 3 times 1/4 to the 1 plus 2. So that would 3 times 1/4 to the 3rd. So that'd be 1/64. We cubed it, so we have 3/64. Well, those are getting pretty small. Maybe I'll try -1. So 3 times 1/4, -1 plus 2. So 3 times 1/4 to the 1st. So that's just 3/4. So these are all pretty small, but let's see if that helps us here. 0 and 3/16. That's pretty close to 0. 1 and 3/64, so that's even smaller. So it must be running alongside that. Negative 2 and 3. What was the other one we had? Negative 1 and 3/4. Yep, so here's our swoop. I missed those there, but you guys can see what that is. So our domain, we can have any x value, but our range, y, has to be greater than 0. And then what about this last one here? We got a lot of negatives going on. So we got some, those are those reflections, but our asymptote, it's still at 1. We have that plus 1. And it's got to be reflected in some way with those negatives. So let's make our xy table. So when x is 0, negative 2 to the negative 0 plus 1. So negative 2 to the 0 plus 1. Now remember, anything to the 0 power is 1. So this part here is 1. So negative 1 plus 1. Well, that's 0. Let me see. What if I did 1? Negative 2 to the negative 1 plus 1. So this would be negative, again, I'm taking care of this exponent part first. So half plus 1. Well, that's half. Well, what happens if we would do negative 1? So negative 2 to the negative 1 plus 1. So that'd be negative 2 to the first plus 1. So negative 2 plus 1 is 1. So what's negative 2? Negative 2 to the negative 2 plus 1. Oh, to the opposite of negative 2. So that's negative 2 squared plus 1. So again, that's 4. So negative 4 plus 1 is negative 3. All right, so let's see what we have here. So 0, 0. What else? Whoops. 1.5. Negative 1 and 1. Well, that can't be possible. That's an asymptote. Let's check that in a second. Negative 2, 1, 2, 3, and negative 3. We got to check that. This one, that wasn't making any sense. So when we plug in negative 1, I think that was over here. Oh, yep. Right here. Negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1. So we can see we have our swoop there. So if we look at that, there were two reflections because we had the opposite x and the opposite out in front. So it flipped and flipped again. So our domain is all reals, and then our range, y, has to be less than 1.